The morning mist clung to the wooden platform like a shroud, making the freshly constructed gallows appear ghostly in the pale dawn light. Sheriff Marcus Blackwood adjusted his worn leather holster and checked his pocket watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The execution was scheduled for sunrise, and he had never been late for his duties in 23 years of law enforcement. The town of Redemption Falls had seen its share of violence, but nothing quite like the case of Elena Vasquez. The young woman sat in her cell, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face as she stared at her shackled hands. She had been convicted of murdering Thomas Hartwell, the wealthy ranch owner who controlled half the territory around their small frontier town. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Witnesses had seen her fleeing his property the night he was found dead, and her knife was discovered buried in his chest. Elena had maintained her innocence throughout the trial, but her Spanish accent and foreign appearance had worked against her in a town where prejudice ran deeper than the nearby copper mines. The all-male jury had deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their verdict. Judge Harrison, known for his harsh sentences, had wasted no time in ordering her execution. As Sheriff Blackwood walked toward the jail cells, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about this case. Elena had no history of violence, and those who knew her described her as gentle and hard-working. She had come to town 6 months earlier, fleeing poverty in Mexico with hopes of starting a new life. Instead, she found herself working as a seamstress and taking care of her younger brother Miguel, who had fallen ill with consumption. The sheriff found Elena sitting calmly on her narrow cot, her rosary beads moving slowly through her fingers as she whispered prayers in Spanish. When she looked up at him, her eyes were clear and unafraid, which unsettled him more than tears or pleas for mercy would have. "It's time, Miss Vasquez," he said softly, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. Elena nodded and stood gracefully, her chains rattling softly. "I forgive you for what you must do, Sheriff. You are only following the law." Her composure struck him like a physical blow. In his years of experience, truly guilty criminals usually showed fear, anger, or desperate attempts to bargain for their lives. Elena displayed none of these reactions. Instead, she seemed almost serene, as if she had made peace with her fate. As they walked through the jailhouse, Deputy Harrison joined them, his young face pale with nervousness. This would be his first execution, and his hands trembled slightly as he helped escort the prisoner. The morning air was crisp and carried the scent of wildflowers from the nearby meadows, a cruel contrast to the grim task ahead. Outside, a crowd had already gathered in the town square. Most of the faces belonged to people Sheriff Blackwood had known for years: the baker, the blacksmith, several farmers, and their wives. But their expressions seemed foreign to him now, twisted with a bloodthirsty excitement that made his stomach turn. They called out crude remarks and accusations, their voices blending into an ugly chorus of hatred. Elena kept her head high as they climbed the wooden steps to the platform. The rope hung ominously from the crossbeam, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Father Mackenzie, the local priest, waited beside the gallows, with his Bible clutched tightly in his weathered hands. He had visited Elena multiple times during her imprisonment, and the sheriff noticed the deep concern etched into the old man's features. "Do you have any last words, Miss Vasquez?" Sheriff Blackwood asked, following the required protocol even though every fiber of his being rebelled against what was happening. Elena looked out over the hostile crowd, her gaze moving from face to face until it settled on something in the distance. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, so brief the sheriff almost missed it. "I am innocent of Thomas Hartwell's murder," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the square. "But I pray that God forgives those who have condemned me, for they know not what they do." The crowd jeered at her words, but Sheriff Blackwood noticed several people shifting uncomfortably. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store, even lowered her eyes and turned away. As the sheriff reluctantly placed the noose around Elena's neck, she whispered something so quietly that only he could hear. "Look for the truth in the mines, Sheriff. Thomas found something he shouldn't have." Before he could ask what she meant, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. People began shouting and pointing toward the main road leading into town. Through the morning haze, Sheriff Blackwood could see a rider approaching at full gallop, dust billowing behind his horse like smoke from a wildfire. The figure grew larger as it approached, and the sheriff could make out the silhouette of a man wearing buckskin and a wide-brimmed hat. There was something familiar about the way he sat his horse, something that triggered a memory the sheriff couldn't quite place. Elena had gone completely still at the sight of the approaching rider, her breathing barely perceptible. The crowd's jeering had died down to confused murmurs as everyone watched the newcomer race toward the town square with obvious urgency. Sheriff Blackwood's hand instinctively moved toward his gun. Something about this situation felt wrong, and after 23 years of keeping the peace, he had learned to trust his instincts. The execution was supposed to proceed without incident, but the arrival of this mysterious rider changed everything. The horse and rider were now close enough that individual details became visible. The man was tall and lean, with long, dark hair tied back and bronze skin that spoke of mixed heritage. His clothes were travel-stained and dust-covered, suggesting he had ridden hard for many miles. Most importantly, his face carried an expression of desperate determination that made the sheriff's pulse quicken. As the crowd watched in stunned silence, the rider's voice rang out across the square, powerful and commanding despite the distance. Though his words weren't yet clear, the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. He was shouting something repeatedly, waving his arms as his horse thundered toward the gallows. Sheriff Blackwood glanced down at Elena and saw that tears were now streaming down her face for the first time since her arrest. But these weren't tears of fear or despair. They were tears of recognition, hope, and something else he couldn't identify. The approaching rider was now close enough that his words became distinct, echoing across the square with the force of a battle cry. What he was shouting would change everything Sheriff Blackwood thought he knew about justice, truth, and the case that had haunted him for weeks. "Stop! Stop the execution!" The words thundered across the square as the rider's horse skidded to a halt just feet from the gallows platform. "Hang me instead! Spare her! I killed Thomas Hartwell!" Sheriff Blackwood's hand froze on the lever that would spring the trap door. The crowd erupted in confused shouts and angry protests, but all the sheriff could focus on was the man dismounting his lathered horse with fluid grace. He was younger than the sheriff had initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with the build of someone who lived by physical labor and outdoor survival. "Who are you?" Sheriff Blackwood demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "And what gives you the right to interrupt a legal execution?" The newcomer strode forward with confident steps, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden planks of the platform. Up close, his features showed the mixed heritage common to the borderlands: Spanish, Apache, and perhaps some Anglo blood. His dark eyes held a fierce intelligence and an unwavering determination that commanded attention. "My name is Diego Vasquez," he announced, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "Elena is my sister, and she is innocent of murder. I am the one who killed Thomas Hartwell, and I demand to face justice for my crime." The revelation hit the gathered townspeople like a physical blow. Elena's brother, the sickly young man who had supposedly died months ago from consumption. But the man standing before them was anything but weak or dying. He radiated strength and vitality, every movement speaking of someone comfortable with danger and violence. "Miguel," Elena whispered, her voice breaking with emotion, "but you were so ill. I thought I had to let you think I was dying, Elena," Diego said, his voice gentle now as he looked up at his sister. "It was the only way to protect you from what I was planning to do. Thomas Hartwell deserved to die for what he had done. but I never meant for you to take the blame." Sheriff Blackwood held up his hand to quiet the increasingly agitated crowd. His mind was racing, trying to process this unexpected development. If this man was telling the truth, then they had been about to execute an innocent woman. But if he was lying to save his sister, then he was throwing his own life away for nothing. "You'll need to prove your claims," the sheriff said firmly. "Anyone can confess to a crime after the fact. Give me details that only the real killer would know." Diego nodded grimly and began to speak with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed his confession many times. "I killed him in his study on the night of March 15th. He was sitting behind his desk, counting money from his latest business transaction. I entered through the window facing the back garden, the one with the broken latch that he never bothered to fix. He looked up when he heard me, and his first words were, 'I wondered when you'd come.'" Several people in the crowd gasped. These details hadn't been released to the public during Elena's trial. Only the sheriff, the judge, and a few key witnesses knew about the study's layout and the condition of Hartwell's body when it was discovered. "Continue," Sheriff Blackwood said, though his stomach was already sinking with the growing realization that they had made a terrible mistake. "Hartwell reached for the gun he kept in his desk drawer, but I was faster. I had my knife out before he could clear leather. We struggled for a moment, and during the fight he managed to scratch my arm." Diego rolled up his left sleeve to reveal a healing scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. "He died quickly after I stuck the blade between his ribs. I wiped the knife clean and left it there, thinking it would look like a robbery gone wrong." The sheriff's blood ran cold. The scratch marks on Hartwell's fingernails had been one piece of evidence that never quite fit with Elena's arrest. She had no corresponding wounds, and the prosecution had simply ignored this inconsistency. "But why?" Sheriff Blackwood asked. "Why did you kill him?" Diego's expression darkened, and for the first time, the sheriff caught a glimpse of the rage that burned beneath his controlled exterior. "Because Thomas Hartwell was a slave trader, Sheriff. He was buying and selling human beings, Mexican families, Apache prisoners, anyone he could get his hands on. He had a network that stretched from Texas to California, and he was getting rich off human misery." The crowd's angry shouts died down to stunned silence. Slavery had been abolished after the war, but everyone knew that illegal trafficking still occurred in remote frontier territories where law enforcement was sparse. "That's a serious accusation," Sheriff Blackwood said. "Do you have proof?" "Check the mines outside town. The ones he claimed were abandoned copper shafts. You'll find hidden chambers where he kept his merchandise before shipping them west. Look for the ledger he kept locked in the safe behind the painting of his dead wife. It contains names, dates, and prices for every person he sold into bondage." Elena was sobbing openly now, finally understanding the full scope of what her brother had discovered and why he had felt compelled to take action. "Miguel, why didn't you tell me? We could have gone to the authorities." "What authorities?" Diego interrupted, his voice bitter. "Hartwell owned half the officials in this territory, including Judge Harrison. He had been operating for years without interference because he made sure the right people got their share of the profits. The only justice he was ever going to face was the kind I gave him." Sheriff Blackwood felt the world tilting beneath his feet. If Diego was telling the truth, then corruption reached to the highest levels of local government. The judge who had sentenced Elena to death, the prosecutor who had rushed the case through court, the witnesses who had been so eager to testify against a friendless Mexican woman, how many of them had been protecting Hartwell's operation? "You expect me to believe that Thomas Hartwell, one of the most respected men in the territory, was running a slave ring?" the sheriff asked, though his conviction was wavering with each passing moment. "Respected by whom?" Diego shot back. "By the men who profited from his crimes? Sheriff, you've always struck me as an honest man. Look into your own heart and tell me this case felt right to you. Tell me you didn't have doubts about Elena's guilt." The sheriff couldn't answer because Diego was right. Every instinct he possessed had screamed that something was wrong about the case against Elena. The evidence had been too convenient, the witnesses too eager, and the defendant's behavior too inconsistent with guilt. "Even if what you're saying is true," Sheriff Blackwood said slowly, "you still committed murder. Vigilante justice is still murder under the law." "I know that," Diego replied simply. "I'm not asking for mercy or special treatment. I'm asking for justice, real justice, not the kind that condemns innocent people to protect the guilty. Hang me if you must, but let my sister go free. She never knew what I was planning, and she certainly never harmed Thomas Hartwell." Father Mackenzie, who had remained silent throughout the dramatic confrontation, suddenly stepped forward. "Sheriff, as God is my witness, this man speaks the truth about his sister's innocence. Elena confessed her sins to me many times during her imprisonment, and murder was never among them. She prayed constantly for Thomas Hartwell's soul, even believing him to be her victim. No guilty person could maintain such a deception before God." The crowd was growing restless again, with some people calling for both siblings to be hanged, while others demanded proof of Diego's claims before proceeding. Sheriff Blackwood realized that he was facing the most difficult decision of his career. Every protocol and procedure demanded that he continue with Elena's scheduled execution while investigating Diego's confession separately. But every moral instinct he possessed told him that would be a grave injustice. "Deputy Harrison," he called to his young assistant, "escort Miss Vasquez back to her cell while we sort this out. Mr. Vasquez, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Hartwell and interfering with a legal execution." "Sheriff!" Judge Harrison's voice boomed across the square as the man himself pushed through the crowd. His face was flushed red with anger and exertion. "What is the meaning of this delay? The execution was ordered by the court, and it will proceed as scheduled." Sheriff Blackwood looked at the judge, noting for the first time how quickly he had arrived at the scene and how determined he seemed to see Elena dead. Diego's accusations about corruption suddenly seemed much more plausible. "Your Honor, new evidence has come to light that requires investigation before we proceed," the sheriff said carefully. "New evidence? This man's desperate attempt to save his sister is not evidence. It's an obstruction of justice." Judge Harrison's voice carried across the square. "I order you to continue with the execution immediately." The sheriff found himself caught between the law he had sworn to uphold and the justice he was meant to serve. One path led to following orders and possibly executing an innocent woman. The other led to defying a direct order from a judge and potentially destroying his career. As he stood on the gallows platform with the entire town watching, Sheriff Blackwood realized that some decisions transcend law and order. They define who a person truly is when faced with moral crisis. Sheriff Blackwood looked from the furious judge to the expectant crowd, then up at Elena, who still stood on the gallows with the noose around her neck. In that moment, 23 years of law enforcement experience crystallized into perfect clarity. He had spent his career believing that following orders and upholding the law were the same thing, but now he understood that sometimes they were opposite forces. "No," he said quietly, but his voice carried across the silent square. "I will not execute this woman until we have thoroughly investigated these new claims." Judge Harrison's face turned purple with rage. "Sheriff Blackwood, you are in contempt of court. I order you to proceed with the execution immediately, or I will have you arrested for dereliction of duty." "Then arrest me," Sheriff Blackwood replied, removing Elena's noose with steady hands. "But you'll have to find someone else to be your executioner." The crowd erupted in chaos, with some people shouting support for the sheriff while others demanded both Vasquez siblings be hanged immediately. Through the noise, Sheriff Blackwood heard Diego's voice, calm and carrying despite the turmoil. "Sheriff, Send someone to check Hartwell's study right now. Look behind the painting of his wife. There's a safe hidden in the wall. The combination is 315, the date I killed him. Inside, you'll find evidence that will prove everything I've told you." Judge Harrison stepped forward aggressively. "I forbid any search of Thomas Hartwell's property. This man's word means nothing, and I will not allow the reputation of a deceased pillar of our community to be tarnished by desperate lies." But Sheriff Blackwood was already signaling to Deputy Harrison. "Take 3 men and ride out to the Hartwell Ranch immediately. Search the study exactly as Mr. Vasquez described. If you find nothing, we'll proceed with the original sentence. If you find what he claims is there—" He left the sentence hanging, but everyone understood the implications. "You cannot do this," Judge Harrison protested. "I am ordering you to stop." "Your Honor," Sheriff Blackwood said, his voice taking on a steel edge, "my duty is to serve justice, not to serve judges who might be protecting criminals. If you're so certain these accusations are false, then you should welcome a search that will prove it." The judge's face went from purple to pale gray in seconds. His reaction was so obvious that even some of his supporters in the crowd began to look skeptical. An innocent man would have welcomed the chance to clear a dead friend's name, not fought so desperately to prevent investigation. While Deputy Harrison gathered his search party, Diego continued his revelations. "Sheriff, you'll also want to check the abandoned mines about 5 miles northwest of town. Hartwell used them as holding areas before transporting people west. If you dig around the main shaft, you'll find personal belongings, jewelry, family photographs, children's toys, things that were taken from families before they were sold." Elena, now free from the noose but still in shackles, spoke for the first time since her brother's arrival. "Miguel, how did you learn about Hartwell's crimes? How did you know what he was doing?" Diego's expression grew dark with painful memory. "I wasn't really dying, Elena. I was working undercover for the Territorial Marshal's office, investigating reports of missing families along the border. When I got too close to Hartwell's operation, he had me beaten and left for dead in the desert. That's when I came home to you, pretending to be sick, so he wouldn't realize I had survived." The crowd was listening intently now, caught up in a story that was proving to be far more complex than anyone had imagined. Sheriff Blackwood found himself believing every word, not just because the details were convincing, but because they explained so many things that had never made sense about the original case. "I spent months gathering evidence," Diego continued, "but every time I was ready to move against him, more families would disappear. I realized that someone in authority was warning him about investigations. When I finally confronted him that night, he actually laughed. He told me that half the territorial government was in his pocket, and that no one would ever be able to touch him." "So you killed him," Sheriff Blackwood said. "It wasn't a question." "I killed him," Diego confirmed without remorse. "And I would do it again. The only thing I regret is that Elena got caught up in my war against him." Father Mackenzie, who had been listening with growing horror, stepped forward. "Sheriff, I believe this man speaks the truth. I've heard confessions from several families who claimed their relatives had disappeared after dealing with Thomas Hartwell, but I always assumed they had simply moved on to other territories." Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching horses announced Deputy Harrison's return. He rode hard into the square, his young face flushed with excitement and disbelief. Behind him, 2 other deputies carried a heavy strongbox and several bundles of papers. "Sheriff," Deputy Harrison called out, dismounting quickly, "we found everything exactly where he said it would be. The safe was hidden behind the painting and the combination worked perfectly. Inside was this ledger with names, dates, and prices for dozens of people. There are also maps showing routes to California and Arizona and correspondence with buyers as far away as Mexico City." Judge Harrison made a desperate lunge toward the strongbox, but Sheriff Blackwood intercepted him with a firm hand on his chest. "Interesting reaction for someone who claimed these accusations were false, Your Honor." The judge's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand. Hartwell wasn't just running a business, he was providing a service. Those people were criminals, vagrants, undesirables, who were better off working somewhere productive. I was protecting this community. The admission hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Several people gasped audibly, while others began backing away from the judge as if his corruption might be contagious. Sheriff Blackwood felt sick as he realized how close they had come to executing an innocent woman to protect this monstrous conspiracy. "So you knew," Sheriff Blackwood said, his voice thick with disgust. "You knew Elena was innocent, and you were willing to let her hang to protect Hartwell's operation and your own involvement." "She's Mexican!" Judge Harrison spat, his mask of respectability completely gone now. "Who cares if one more of them dies? They're not real Americans anyway." The racist venom in his words finally broke the last of his support among the townspeople. Even those who had cheered for Elena's execution now looked ashamed and horrified. Mrs. Patterson, the store owner who had turned away during the execution, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Sheriff, I want to confess something," she said in a trembling voice. "Thomas Hartwell paid me to testify that I saw Elena running from his property that night. I needed the money for my sick husband's medicine, and I told myself it didn't matter because everyone said she was guilty anyway. I'm sorry, I'm so very sorry." Her confession opened the floodgates. Over the next hour, 3 more witnesses came forward to admit they had been bribed to provide false testimony. The blacksmith revealed that Hartwell had promised him lucrative contracts if he supported the prosecution. Even the prosecutor's assistant admitted that key evidence had been suppressed during the trial. Sheriff Blackwood listened to each confession with growing anger, not just at the corruption, but at his own failure to see through the deception. He had allowed his trust in the legal system to blind him to the injustice happening right in front of him. As the afternoon wore on, Deputy Harrison returned from the mines with even more damning evidence. They had found personal belongings from dozens of missing families, along with makeshift holding cells carved into the rock. Most horrifying of all, they discovered graves, shallow burial sites for those who had died while being held captive. By evening, Judge Harrison was in chains awaiting transport to the territorial capital for trial. Several other officials had fled town, confirming their involvement in Hartwell's operation. Elena was formally cleared of all charges and released, while Diego was taken into custody pending a formal review of his actions. Sheriff Blackwood found himself in the unusual position of recommending leniency for a confessed killer. In his official report, he wrote that Diego Vasquez had acted to stop crimes that law enforcement had failed to address, and that his actions, while illegal, had served the cause of justice more than the corrupt legal system he had circumvented. 3 months later, Diego was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a remarkably light sentence for murder, but one that reflected the extraordinary circumstances of his case. The territorial governor, facing a massive scandal over corruption in his administration, was eager to show that justice could still prevail in the frontier territories. Elena remained in Redemption Falls, where the townspeople, many of whom had called for her death, now went out of their way to show kindness and make amends for their earlier behavior. She opened a school for Mexican and Apache children, teaching them to read and write in both Spanish and English. The building fund was mysteriously well supported by anonymous donations from townspeople seeking to ease their consciences. Sheriff Blackwood kept his badge, but the experience changed him forever. He instituted new procedures requiring multiple sources of evidence for serious crimes and established regular reviews of all convictions. He also began learning Spanish, feeling that better communication with the territory's Mexican population might prevent future injustices. 5 years later, when Diego was released from prison, he returned to Redemption Falls to find a very different town than the one he had left. His sister's school was thriving. The corrupt officials had been replaced with honest men, and Sheriff Blackwood had become something of a legend for his stand against judicial corruption. Diego never married or settled down permanently, instead becoming a deputy marshal and spending his life hunting down human traffickers throughout the southwestern territories. But every Christmas, he returned to Redemption Falls to visit Elena and to stand with Sheriff Blackwood at Thomas Hartwell's grave, not to mourn, but to remember that sometimes justice requires ordinary people to make extraordinary choices, even when those choices carry terrible personal costs. The gallows where Elena had nearly died was dismantled the day after her release. In its place, the town built a small monument with a simple inscription: "Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice misdirected is justice destroyed." Sheriff Blackwood had suggested the words, wanting future generations to remember that the law is only as good as the people who enforce it, and that sometimes the greatest courage is required not to follow orders, but to refuse them when they conflict with what is right.